Silvio, he was elected under a system which passes the first test of any democracy, which is that the incumbent in power can be removed without violence. What has happened thus far to three democracies in the European Union is what Germany's greatest moral voice, Jürgen Habermas, has called a legitimation crisis, where we have elected governments who retain the legal authority by which to govern, but are not able to demonstrate that its practical functioning fulfills the end for which it was instituted. That this is happening partly at the behest of the German banks and largely through the diplomacy of Angela Merkel is both tragic and ironic. The most powerful agents in this crisis are the bond markets, and we could be reaching the stage where markets and democracy are becoming incompatible. What is emerging is a series of crises, separate but all connected. Banking crises, fiscal crises, sovereign debt crises, growth crises, austerity crises, political crises, democratic crises, a whole series of crises of legitimacy. Something is in its death throes, either the spirit of social solidarity or the dogma of neoliberalism. We cannot stand idly by and hope it is the latter. We must be agents of change and grapple with the reality we face. So far, the other side has taken the initiative and has been largely making the running. Just after Obama entered office in 2009, his chief of staff noted that we should never miss the opportunity thrown up by a good crisis. Since then, however, the right has steamrolled its way to the top of the agenda, effectively laying siege to the White House and rolling over the rights of workers in many states, not only Wisconsin. The private banking crisis has been recast as a crisis of public debt. This is some reversal of fortune. This delusion has taken hold of policymakers from the US Congress to the Parliament, from Stormont to Westminster to Dáil Éireann. Last summer, David Begg participated in the Brussels Economic Forum, an annual event organised by the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. The keynote address was given by Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, the German Finance Minister. He made a number of points which, from our perspective, were fairly chilling. Namely that, one, the Eurozone did not have a crisis, just some peripheral countries. And two, that his idea of solidarity was containing the problem in those countries and preventing contagion to others. So let's not fool ourselves that the decision of the European Council in recent weeks was about Greece or Ireland. It was about Italy and the possibility that it would be next. With 1.9 trillion euro of sovereign debt, 3 times as much as Ireland, Greece and Portugal combined, it is of a different order of magnitude. It is too big to bail out and too big to fail. Contrary to what Dr. Schäuble said, the problem is systemic and recent efforts are not the complete answer. The solution must eventually involve Europeanization of the debt, preferably by means of a common Eurobond. The only way that Italy could only stay in the Eurozone is if its interest rates were reduced, and there is little other than a Eurobond which could achieve this. I cannot see how the Euro will survive the crisis without creating institutions for fiscal and economic coordination. But the deeper integration which this implies is out of line with political mood music in many Eurozone countries right now. This is hardly surprising, because for all the talk of reform, the perceived cause of the crisis, the European banking system, remains substantially unaltered. The hedge funds remain unregulated. There has been no serious reinstatement of the equivalent of the Glass-Steagall Act to separate retail and investment banking. The rating agencies will pronounce on the soundness of banks and banking companies as if they had no part in the crisis. Any financial transaction tax is facing death by veto from the sovereign city of London and its spokesperson, George Osborne. And of course, the bonus culture operates as it always did. Reform then for the little people. And what about the ECB? Well, all about it is chaos. It pursues its bonus inspired singular obsession with price stability, even though the economics of the periphery are in meltdown and there's no evidence of wage inflation in the poor countries. So Europe too has hard decisions to make, and they involve politicians telling their constituents the facts of life about what is necessary to save the euro. This will be hard because even as the heavily indebted countries are pushed towards insolvency, the numbers of disaffected and creditor countries is also growing, as manifested in increasing support for Eurosceptic and nationalistic parties such as the True Finns in Finland. The reality, though, is that there is no way that countries like Ireland can meet the terms of the bailout agreements. However, if the endgame does involve some form of Europeanisation of debt, it seems to me that will also involve completion of economic and monetary union, meaning fiscal union. This is the remorseless logic of which George Osborne recently spoke. It is hardly likely that in such circumstances Ireland would be allowed to pursue an independent tax policy indefinitely. This is another hard decision because we will no longer be able to balance our industrial policy on the one-legged stool of low corporation tax, at least not indefinitely. It is not a decision about which we are ultimately likely to be allowed much choice, even though it would be manifestly unjust to treat the periphery and the core of Europe exactly the same. The likelihood is, however, that Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Italy, and eventually Spain, and then some of the more recent member states, will be considered peripheral in a new and nasty way. The core countries will need our markets and our labour supply, but won't have much time for our democracy. Put plainly, we will eat at the edge of the table where the real decisions are made. Not that we will be alone. The UK has deliberately opted to remain at the fringes of European power for decades, but it is open to ongoing debate if this was a wise course for both Britain and the European Union. Put simply, for the next few years, if this mess is ever sorted out, the so-called pigs will not matter. Their views won't count. They won't be heard. This is how the poor are treated by the media, invisible, except as subjects of pity in shows like The Secret Millionaire, or as objects of fear and loathing, as in the coverage of the riots over the summer. This is how the regions of the United Kingdom are treated by the metropolitan shapers of opinion, as a colourful backdrop with funny accents, or as a financial blockade leeching off the titans of the city. But there are alternatives, and we must be part of it. Occasionally, a successful challenge is mustered to the master narrative, and democracy actually prevails. An alternative is possible and gets rewarded at the polls. In the Irish presidential election last month, the people had a choice between two front runners. One was a celebrity capitalist, a judge on the Irish version of Dragon's Den, a front for Fianna Fáil, a Manchurian candidate for the interests who have traditionally won out every time. The winner was this time a poet and professor of sociology, a long-standing defender of free speech and human rights, a critic of imperialism, Cartesian dualism and gesture politics, whose platform was their critique of what he called the speculative economy.